And Mr. Kunkle, you have 4 aircraft, is that right?
Got 6.
6.
Well,
6
that
aircraft.
counts my son and grandson.
That's right.
So we all 3 fly, so.
So Mr. Kunkle's still flying. He told me just a little while ago that he was flying before the rains not too long ago. And so that's one of his aircraft.
No, I'm 96 and approaching 97. And so I came prepared today because, you know, certain things give out and I don't hear very well. So hearing aids don't work too well, but these Bose I can usually hear. So, and it's the same as the headset we use in an airplane.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, can we just say thank you to the Kunkles for making the visit today with an applause?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm really impressed with your school and all the young folks that I've met here.
Well, let's kind of just start from the beginning. I know a little bit about your father. He was in World War I. Is that correct?
My dad was in World War I, and he wanted to be an aviator, and unfortunately, he was involved in an accident before he could get overseas, and he was in the hospital for some time, and that curtailed any chance of being an aviator. I was born in Pennsylvania, in New Kensington, which was a mill town. We lived in an area where they had tremendous steel production just up the river from Pittsburgh. And actually, I was born in 1922. As you know, if you've been reading history, and I know that you have, we had a big depression in 1929. So I kind of grew up in that era of the depression. And unfortunately, 1932, my dad had sold out of his business, and we were coming to California, and unfortunately, he went to the hospital in New York and passed away. I was 9 years old. My mother, we had kind of a large house, and I remember the Depression very well. We had a large home and a finished basement, and they had the big furnace in the basement, so it was always warm. And I can remember as a youngster that we'd get people would stop that hadn't been fed, hadn't eaten, didn't have a home. They were transients. They were going someplace, and my mother always fed them. And they'd spend the night and then go on about their business. And the good thing about it was that she would feed them, but they always wanted to work. They wanted to return what she had given them. So when my dad passed away, my mother, I can remember asking me if I wanted to go to California. And I said yes, and so she took some driving lessons, and we drove to California. It was quite an interesting trip. We came out Route 66 when they were building it. And I've always said that my mother prayed her way across the country and I pushed because we were in the mud a good part of the time.
Wow.
So from there, I grew up in West Hollywood, Beverly Hills, went to Beverly Hills High, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot. It's the mid-30s. I went to high school in Beverly Hills, and I would spend all my weekends out at Grand Central Air Terminal, which was the airfield in Glendale, which has been closed for a number of years, but you can still see the remnants of the airfield. And I would work on Saturdays, and some days we'd even go out on Sunday afternoons. And if you worked real hard and anybody had a little extra money, you might get a 20-minute flight in an airplane. So that's where I started flying. And my intentions were to be an Air Force pilot, Army Air Corps pilot. The war started in September 1939, and I would have started my senior year in high school. And when the war started, I figured out that we weren't going to have the ability to stay out of the war. So I thought, well, I better get some experience. So I went down and joined the California Air National Guard. And we had an airfield in Griffith Park, of all places. And it was the closest military airfield to Los Angeles. And it was a very small airfield, but we'd get all the transient military aircraft. So I got to meet a lot of people in the Air Guard. I was behind the rank. I was a rear rank private, and but all of our pilot officers were mainly World War I combat people. So I got to listen in and hear what it was like in World War I to be a fighter pilot and what you should do and what you should look forward to. The Air Guard, in 1940, the Air Guard, we went on maneuvers up in Washington, the state of Washington, and we were attacking Fort Lewis. And it was very obvious. The equipment we had was all early 30s, biplanes, open cockpits, the same as World War I. And here we're getting ready, supposedly, to protect our country. World War II. The equipment we had was, we didn't have anything. Everything we had was left over from World War I. And so, September 1940, we attacked Fort Lewis. It was pretty interesting. We dropped little 1-pound bags of flour from the aircraft, and that was simulating bombs. So the 4 infantry guys, we'd attack them with these little paper bags. The flour would spread out. Their bridges knocked out, so they'd have to wade across a river. But we weren't very popular. But in September 40, we came back to Los Angeles after 3 weeks up there, and they federalized the Air Guard. They took it on active duty. I wasn't 18 years old yet, and so I couldn't go. I had to wait for a later day. But from the time that I got out of the Guard, I was going to college. We had to, in order to be an aviation cadet, you had to be 21 years of age, and you had to have 2 years of college. So I was intent on getting that 2 years of college as quickly as possible. So that I was working on that goal. The time in school was excellent. I mean, we had excellent training, but when the war started in 1941, December, the military decided they needed aviators. They dropped the age limit to 18 and a high school education. So about 500,000 youngsters just like me went down and signed up to become an aviation cadet.
Jim, can I ask you, what are your recollections of December 7th, 1941, and the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor?
I had a big horse, a big jumping horse that I kept down at Riverside Drive and Los Feliz Boulevard in Griffith Park, right where our airfield had been. And I was riding early Sunday morning out in Griffith Park. Several of us were riding together, and this young fellow who was some kind of a movie star, and I had met him briefly, came along and said, "Did you hear the Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor?" And that was it. That's when I found out that World War II was really beginning. Naturally, your first thought is, well, when I left the Air Guard, they promised me I'd be in the State Guard, so I didn't know whether I was in military service or not. So we got that cleared up, and I immediately, as I said, I went down and signed up as a cadet.
Did you and your mother have any conversations about you going to war, or do you know how she felt about that prospect?
I had strong feelings when the Guard was federalized. I could have gone with them if my mother had a sign for me. But she wouldn't do it. She said, "You're on the track to be a fighter pilot. Don't change directions at this time." When I was going to college, the summer of 1940, I would have been the summer that I spent with the Guard. So in 1941, I'm in college. The war hasn't started yet, but through the Guard, I got a job at North American Aviation for the summer, and I worked on the first 10 P-51s that were built from the experimental on. That, while I was at North American, I decided maybe I ought to take a crack at the Canadians. They were looking for pilots, and so I tried to get an appointment to the Canadian Air Force, and I ran up against the same problem. My mother had to sign for me, and that wasn't going to happen. So I had to wait till the war started. I had to wait till they dropped the age limit and the other specifications that they required, and went through then as a cadet.
So Jim, we're going to get to the World War II stuff here in a second, but one question before we do. Charles Lindbergh, you just told me Charles Lindbergh was one of your heroes.
Yes.
Can you kind of just set the scene about how important Charles Lindbergh was for people like you to dream about aviation?
Well, aviation was in it prior to the golden age of aviation, which was really the 1920s and 30s. And Lindbergh did something that no one else had done. If you've ever seen the motion picture of the Lindbergh flight, Jimmy Stewart played Lindbergh. It's an excellent picture, and it's pretty much true to life. So in 1927, I'm 5 years old, and I'd already made up my mind I wanted to be an aviator. So he became my hero, and he was very important. He was the one that inspired all of us youngsters to aviation. I think that all of my friends that I went to school with, we all wanted to fly. We all wanted to be fighter pilots or bomber pilots or something. And unfortunately for some of them, my class was 1940 in Beverly Hills, and when all my schoolmates, it's amazing how many of them, when the war started, they immediately ran down. Some of them joined the Marines, some of them joined the Army. And when you visit Beverly Hills High School and you talk about the class of 1940, it's amazing how many of them didn't survive the war.
There's a street in Normandy, France, right now that bears his name. So we'll get to that story here soon. But can you just talk about the P-38 particularly? Like, this is a very unique aircraft. Can you just give them a sense of the design and the function and the skills you would need to fly that?
Well, it was our first really 400-mile-an-hour World War II combat airplane. I mentioned I worked at North American for the summer of 1941. Well, I made 35 cents an hour, and I didn't know what to do with all that money. I worked with people that had come out from the Midwest. their whole family lived off that 35 cents an hour. And so when I left to go back to school, left North American to go back to school, I went to Lockheed. They had a graveyard shift. So I got a job at Lockheed, and guess what? I ended up working on the P-38 line. And I worked the whole winter of 1941 when the war started until I actually went on active duty as a cadet. But we did get a raise. We were raised to 50 cents an hour. So that was pretty important. The 38 was designed in 1937, and it was designed as a high-altitude bomber interceptor. And Kelly Johnson was the engineer at Lockheed that was responsible for it. And he came up with this design. And when you think that the airplanes we had in the Guard, they might do 150 miles an hour. They had a little radial, 550 horsepower radial engine. And Kelly Johnson designed that airplane in the middle of the 30s. We're still in the Depression with two 1,000 horsepower engines, 2,000 horsepower. And the airplane would do 400 miles an hour, and it would climb to 35,000 feet. And so this was unheard of. And then having the opportunity to work on the airplane, I really knew it very well. And so when I was called up as a cadet, and they ask you, what's your preference? Not that you're going to get it, but my preference was I wanted to fly P-38s, and I wanted to go to England. It worked out.
So what kind of difficulty is there for a pilot to manage two engines simultaneously, particularly in combat?
Well, they compare the 38 with the P-51, which was the much later designed airplane. And as I say, I had worked on the 51 at North American. The 51 was a low altitude airplane, and it had wonderful performance, extremely fast on the deck. It was a 400-mile-an-hour airplane on the deck. And when I say on the deck, that's low altitude. And so the 38 was a high-altitude airplane. Well, as the war was developing, particularly in Europe against the Germans, it was a high-altitude war. So the 51 was not an acceptable combat airplane. It was a great reconnaissance airplane. Until they, in 1942, they put a British engine in it, and that was an entirely different story. So you matched the two airplanes. There were three major aircraft that we used in Europe and somewhat in the Pacific. It was the P-47, which was a high-altitude airplane built by Republic, a great big monster airplane. P-38 and the P-51. In combat, the 38 had some drawbacks. Number one, you had two engines, you had two mixture controls and two prop controls. And if you were bounced, and bounce is the word, I shouldn't use old terminology, but bounce meant you were attacked. You had to get all that power in. You had to get the mixture controls up, you had to get the propellers up, you had to get the throttles up to get your power. P-51, the British engine in it, you had one lever. You push the throttle forward, and that was it. And so the prop, you'd already be up, and so it was much easier in combat when you were surprised or going into an attack to do the 51 routine versus the P-38 routine. 38 required more time in the airplane and to really get the maximum out of it. And in combat, your whole purpose is to get the very maximum performance out of that airframe that you can possibly get.
So your squadron was in the 9th Air Force, is that correct?
We were in the 9th Air Force. In England, there were the 8th Air Force, and probably read about the missions that the 8th Bomber Command flew and the horrible losses that we took. The 8th had the heavy B-17s, B-24s, and the escorting fighters. And in the beginning, they had the P-47, which wouldn't go the whole distance with them, so they were taking horrendous losses. So in the preparations for D-Day, they moved the 9th Air Force from Africa and Italy to England. And then we became the Air Force that worked with the Army. Most of our missions were in support of the ground forces, the infantry, the tanks. If they got in trouble, they called us. So our whole purpose was to support the invasion forces. And when I went to England, when I first arrived in England and I was assigned to the 9th, I was a little disappointed. I wanted to be an escort fighter pilot in the heavy bombers because that's where you found all the German fighters. So everybody wanted to be an ace and shoot down lots of airplanes. And so when I was assigned to the 9th Air Force, it was a little disappointing until I actually started flying my missions, and then I realized how we were dedicated to supporting our ground forces. And believe me, those youngsters need support. So
just so you guys put this in context, we're talking about Joe Govea, who was in the Big Red One. We're talking about Jack Moran, frontline, tip of the spear. Mr. Kunkle supporting those guys on the ground, all right, to be able to do their infantry operations.
Well, as we get to it, I'll tell you a little bit about the Big Red One.
Yeah, we'll get to that soon. Do I have this right? In the first year of combat, that the 9th Air Force had 100% turnover. Is that right?
Well, that was the whole way through. My squadron and my group, a fighter group had 3 squadrons, and my squadron, as well as the other 2 squadrons. So for the group, we were actually in combat just 1 year, and we had 100% turnover on KIAs, missing in action, wounded. Like me, I didn't finish my missions. I was shot down, went to the hospital, so I became a casualty. So we had just a little over 100% turnover. It was surprising how many youngsters that we lost on their very first mission. It was the luck of the draw. And so many of our casualties in the 9th Air Force were caused by flak. And because we were working at low altitude, we were getting hit pretty often in the air, and we sustained heavier losses from flak than we did from fighter aircraft.
Can you describe flak? Because we haven't talked about it, and they might not know what flak is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Flak is anything from throwing a stone at an airplane to 30 caliber rifle to 50 caliber machine guns to 20 millimeter quad guns to 40 millimeter light artillery to the dreaded one of all was the German 88. And the 88 was a great big shell, and they were accurate up to 35,000 feet. And it was amazing. The Germans had it down pat on hitting an airplane. We had, most of the bomber losses were actually flak or artillery fire. Early on, the fighters got quite a few, but as our fighters became more proficient, we cut those losses tremendously.
Well, yeah, Gabby, please.
So we talk a lot about like the P-47s, the P-38s, and the P-51. What do the letters and numbers signify?
The P is for pursuit, and that was a World War I term, And when we became the Air Force after the war in 1947, they changed it to fighter. So the P-51 became the F-51, but everybody still calls it a P-51. But pursuit, and then the 47 or the 38 was the linear number of when the airplane was designed. So the P-38 was designed in 1937. The 51 was designed in 1941.
All right, let's go to September 16th, 1944. This is going to be your last combat mission.
I didn't know it at the time.
No, you did not.
But September 16th, 5:45 in the evening to be exact, we had progressed. We landed right after the invasion started, which was June 6th. Immediately upon the infantry landing, in fact, the second day after the invasion in Normandy, they started building airfields. The combat engineers came ashore right behind the infantry, and they started building airfields. And our airfield, where we ended up, was right on the coast, a mile and a half from Omaha Beach and a mile and a half from Point du Hoc, where you read about the Rangers that went up the cliffs to take all the heavy artillery.
Jim, can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
I just want to show them the photo.
Oh, you got it.
So this is the photo I got from Jim. This is the airfield he's talking about. Do you see the channel, coast?
Yeah.
And so this is a farm that an airfield was created. Jim, remind me, which one is your aircraft? Is it this
Right
one?
there.
This one. This is Jim's P-38 that he flew in.
Well, this was A1. This was the first strip built in Normandy after the invasion. And it went operational in 2 weeks, within 2 weeks from the invasion. So there were still German snipers in the countryside around the airfield. The P-47s moved over immediately after D-Day, and they were on the upper side of the photograph. All those revetments up there, parking places, were P-47s. The P-38s, we didn't move to Normandy as quick as the 47s. We had more range with the P-38, so we could still operate out of England, cross the channel, and reach any target in Normandy. P-47s were shorter on fuel, so they had to get them up close. So we moved in 2 or 3 weeks after that, and we moved into the south end of the airfield on the photograph. And the farm that you see right by that's the farm. And then there was another farm across the road that you can't, the house is just out of sight across the road from down in the far left corner. And the gentleman who owned the farm became my good friend while we were based there.
Which is why there's a street named after you.
Yeah, that's
So
probably the
that
reason.
street is in this area where this farm is in Normandy. So you should go visit there. Drive on Jim Kunkle Lane.
Well, if you go to Jim Kunkle Lane, you got to look very carefully to find it. It's a little lane that runs down, and when we landed, that was when Normandy, the Battle of Normandy started. This was a beautiful farm. We came in and tore it up and made the runway and the revetments and everything. And now it's back in a very beautiful farm. And the grandchildren of my old friend live in the farmhouse. And they're like family to us, really. We actually stay with the family across the road.
Jim, can I take you back to September 16th?
Yes.
Our time is getting close to the end. So tell us about this mission.
Well, there wasn't a whole lot to it. The Germans started attacking our we were hitting them pretty hard. The 1st Infantry Division, who we just mentioned,
Yeah.
they were trying to take a town called Aachen, which is a very old medieval town in Germany, one of the oldest towns in Germany. And by September, we're trying to take Aachen, and the Germans are reinforcing Aachen, that was the first city that we were attacking, and they were sending reinforcements in. So our 3 squadrons were up there to dive bomb and strafe. Our squadron was flying top cover to protect them from any enemy aircraft that might be in the area. And so we're orbiting, circling up above Aachen, and I happened to see 2 what we call gaggles. The Germans flew kind of like this. They're forming, so we called them gaggles. There were 2 gaggles of German aircraft coming in to attack our squadron. I spotted them. The person who sees the first enemy aircraft, whoever it is in the squadron who sights that first aircraft, he leads the attack. He calls it in to the rest of the squadron, leads the attack, and that's what I did. I spotted them coming in, called what we called the break, which means that you make a break into the direction of the enemy fighters. I called the break and go into an attack mode. The first thing that happens, I attack one group, and obviously the second group came around and hit me immediately and set me on fire. When that happened, I began to realize that I must be by myself. There's nobody protecting my tail. And so we have at it. My point of view, I just had numerous targets. We're at full power. I'm maneuvering. I'm getting shot up pretty badly. But I'm also firing at what seemed like numerous enemy aircraft, very short bursts. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw some hits on my left wing. And when a 20 millimeter hits your wing or anything like that, it flashes. And so I saw them, and they're walking, this fellow in my tail's walking them up my wing, and I'm firing at one of his friends in front of me. And so between the engine and the nacelle was your fuel tanks. He just walked them right up, hit my fuel tanks. I'm in the cockpit. A cold air vent that came in through the fuel tanks all of a sudden looked like a blowtorch. I knew I was in serious trouble, and I don't remember getting out of the airplane. I don't remember reaching for the escape hatch. In those days, we had to crawl out. You didn't have ejection seats. The next thing I know, I'm falling through a cloud, and I knew the clouds were about 5,000 feet because we'd been yo-yoing through them. Came out the bottom of the cloud. I was falling face up when I came out the bottom of the cloud. I thought I was over German, I knew I was over German territory, but I thought I was over German positions because we had yo-yoed away from Aachen. And I rolled over, and thinking I'm behind the German lines, I didn't pull my chute right away. I waited until I could actually see the ground coming up, and when everything started to look real close, I pulled a ripcord. The chute opened, and I probably couldn't have been over 300 or 400 feet above the ground when the chute opened. And I had time to get my .45 out of my shoulder holster and try to cock it, not knowing my hands would burn. And I dropped it. Came down if I could find the building, I could identify. I came down in the courtyard with a tree in the middle of it. My chute dangled, hit the tree and dangled, and I didn't really touch the ground, but I was probably a foot off the ground when everything came to a stop. Somehow or other, I found a .45, and I recollected it was getting dark, so it seemed like I'd been on the ground a long time, and later I realized that my eyes were burned, and I was swelling up and thinking it's getting dark. And cut a long story short, I'm going along a ditch, and here's some fellas in the ditch, and I thought they were German. And when I realized they had net on their helmets, and our guys had net, I thought, well, I don't want to get in a gunfight with our own people. And so I threw the .45 over my shoulder and put my hands up, and they took me back to the hospital. And that was the 1st Infantry Division. So they had seen the whole fight. I was later in the hospital. I was approached by a lieutenant. He said, "I know you, we picked you up." And he'd been hit the next day. So I found out a good bit of what happened in this fight. And apparently I had up to 20 German aircraft cornered who stayed with me in this engagement. They didn't go on and attack the rest of our squadron. And so it turned out that the young fellow who I met in the hospital had been with the 1st Infantry Division from the North Africa, Sicily, the invasion of Normandy, and up into Germany. And so anyway, in the hospital, they gave me a Purple Heart, and they gave my infantry friend his 7th cluster. That means he had 8 Purple Hearts. He'd been hit 8 times. So that's the type of fellas that we were protected.
Jim, we have maybe time for one more question.
Sure.
And this is a question that students often wonder about, so I'll just ask if they're thinking about it. Did you hate Germans?
No.
What was your feeling towards the enemy?
But my middle name's Kelly, so that makes up for it. But no, I didn't hate them. I think you realize that you're in a dangerous, very dangerous position, and you're trying to protect our ground forces. They're trying to kill not only you, but they're trying to kill our ground forces, and they're trying to drive us. So you have the feeling that anybody you can knock out, knock them out. It wasn't hate. I'd have to think about that that feeling that you have. You want to do your job. You know what it is. You know what you have to accomplish, and you want to do it.
You said something to me regarding these kind of things about making sure that your mind is clear and that there would be nothing to subtract 100% of concentration, which is necessary in this cockpit. Can you explain?
Well, I think that affects not only your feelings for the enemy, but that affects your own safety, and it affects if you have a tendency to fear, the concentration will overcome that. And I don't actually remember fear, but I do remember being nervous. In fact, I had a little test, and you might try it someday. We used to chew gum because we'd start a dive-bombing run at 10,000 feet and pull out much lower, down 2,000 feet. And so you chewed gum to equalize the pressure in your ears. And I've come back from missions where that gum was just chewed to pieces. I mean, it's little pieces in your mouth. You just worn it out. So I would guess that was a nervous reflex. But, and I've been asked about the feeling of fear. And again, I think it's the concentration that you're training, and it's the idea of, as I've said many times in talks, I'd go to bed at night, and before I went to sleep, maybe 15, 20 minutes, a half hour, I'd put myself in different positions, and what will I do if something happens? And in a P-38, one of the things you want to remember on takeoff, you're not in combat on takeoff, but if you lost one of those engines on takeoff, that airplane would roll upside down so quickly that it's like that. So it's, there's a saying, dead engine, dead foot. So you know which engine's going. If you got the foot that you're pushing the hardest on the rudder pedal, that's your good engine. So it's this developing this thought of what do I do when something happens, and it goes in your mind and it works.
Guys, we've just run out of time. I wish we could spend another few hours because there's so much more to say, and I'm sorry about that. But we need to take a picture of you guys with Mr. Kunkle here. Before we do that, can we just say thank you with another applause?
Thank you.
We're really grateful for you. Mr. Kunkle, we're just going to have you stand here kind of close to your hero.
Okay.
And everybody else, would you guys kind of come and gather around? We'll take a one-class shot. Here you go, guys. On 3. 1, 2, 3. One more time. 1, 2, 3. All right, say your goodbyes, and you guys got to be on your way because it's close to the next class time.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks again.
Okay, one more.